Welcome to 41 Avenue podcast, hosted by the Stellenbosch Academy of Design and Photography. We are at the Stellenbosch Triennale 2025, and I'm sitting with Lebogang Kganye. I've seen some of your work, the one where you've taken photographs from your family archive, and then you've put yourself in those photographs. I show them to my students all the time, and they really enjoy that work. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is my earliest work, and that's the work that's had probably the most public life. And I think that's probably the one work that is the most photographic of my practice. So I think also it speaks to many themes that photography touches on. You know, how photography is in many ways related to death, and this idea of like being able to live forever through the photograph, or questions around that, and how photography sort of enables that. And so because it speaks to the journey of the loss of my mother and me tracing her and all of the different sites that she'd been photographed in, wearing the exact same clothes as what she was wearing in most of those photos. This is photos from maybe, at that point, maybe 20 plus years or 30 years before I did that or started that body of project. And so it is in many ways speaking to to sort of the past, the present, and to a large degree the future, and the sort of how death is. All of us will face that somehow, and how photography speaks so much to that.
Yeah, and like with that project, it was about going back into the archive, and you've gone back again into the archive for this particular project. Can you tell us a little bit more about that project?
So this new work, A Burden Consumed in Sips, is, I think, in different ways also quite close to my heart, in that it's also similar to like Gilefalaka, the series Her Story with My Mother, where that was a very personal work. This is not a personal work per se, but it's my first work that's outside of South Africa. So I had been invited by a museum in Germany, in Cologne, 2 years before I actually started making. So this was its second or third edition of this project called Artists Meets Archives. And I'd previously been invited and gently declined by saying that maybe the next edition, because I mean we were quite overwhelmed with work at that point, but also I wasn't necessarily keen on pursuing this type of research. So it was an invitation that was sent to a few different artists to participate in this project or this program called Artists Meets Archives, and it was basically being invited by different museums in the city of Cologne in Germany, and they would have full access to their archives or to their collection, and could respond, critique, whatever it is that it's sort of the collection prompted you to do. And so the second time that they came back, I then agreed, really out of curiosity, but I wasn't sure I would actually be keen to do it because it was an ethnographic museum, and I knew that it would probably hold a lot of difficult material. And also because I wasn't sure I wanted to also be classified, because they were inviting artists that work with archival material. So I wasn't sure if I actually wanted to be, sort of be considered an artist that works with archival material. I always sort of stray away from the word archive in relation to my work. And I've really struggled with that term, I think, because for a long time I've worked with my family stories and family imagery, and I've never considered them archival material, you know. I think it's always been a term that, it just seemed to lack the personal. So I think to accept this invitation for me seemed like I'm accepting my work or my practice to be under the umbrella of like a photographer, an artist that works with archival material. So I mean, I accepted the invitation eventually, and I went to the museum and was interested in not necessarily the photographic material. And so I eventually found landscape drawings. So these long panoramic drawings that were made by this artist, I suppose. So she had come to Germany between 1911 and 1913. So her husband was initially commissioned by the city of Cologne. He was a geographer, and he was sent to or commissioned to come to Cameroon to basically survey the land, whether it was, worth them colonizing, basically.
Okay.
So, so he had motivated for his wife to come with because she was a visual artist. And I mean, women weren't necessarily going on these expeditions, but that was the motivation that he gave. And so she was able to come with him for the 3 years that they were in Cameroon. And she had taken many photographs, which were also in the collection. And she had also made a lot of pen drawings of the landscapes there. There's a lot of material, basically, that's housed in different museums by this couple, like by many other people from that time. And so I eventually found, after many trips going to Cologne, eventually found these drawings, and I knew that that was the material I wanted to work with. But also think about, because I'd always thought around how photography, or sort of had only perceived photography as the violent medium, and especially in thinking about these histories. But it was the first time that I started to think about landscape drawings and how, how landscape drawings also were important as a device to enable colonization, and how they also are presented as like these empty landscapes, and it's, the sort of unoccupied terrain that didn't belong to anybody, that could just, sort of be taken. And, so I started to also in my first encounter with the drawings, I felt seduced by them. It was almost, so there is something that it actually does to you. So, so that, I think that encounter, I think in the sort of obviousness of the photographs, and how, like when you encounter them, it's clear to you that there's violence. The drawings, it was such a different encounter that I wanted to explore that, I think, for myself. And so that's how the work actually started with. That's the first part.
It sounds like you went through a lot of different moments in the work, trying to grapple with how to approach the archive, but also coming to terms with your own kind of feelings about the work. It's interesting that you use the word seductive. Like, I find that really interesting, because it's kind of this contradiction or juxtaposition between the violence of these images, but then also how seductive they seem to be. And I'm curious, how did you, like, when you are working with the archive or with these particular images, how do you deal with those feelings?
I mean, I think because I'd done a few trips to Cologne and was looking for, so I mean, so because the collection is quite large, I mean, there's objects, there's many things, and there's a lot of photographs. So my first, so you obviously have to have a few questions so that you can that guide you through what part of the collection to spend a bit of time with, because you're not going to look at the whole collection, because there's objects, there's things like, there's artifacts, there's photographs, there's sound, there's paintings, there's all of this material, and others aren't part of the sort of official collection. So these drawings were actually not part of the official collection. They were in a box. I think they didn't even know what to do with them. So my sort of initial questions or sort of points of entry into the archives was that I was looking for things that had been taken from South Africa. There weren't many, because also we weren't necessarily colonized by Germans. And then looking at what had been taken from the continent. And then number 3, the question of the female gaze within that context. And so that's how I arrived at eventually, and also that sort of clarity that I didn't want to work with any photographic material. And so that's how eventually, after many trips, the first encounter with the drawings was interesting, but also the fact that it had also been done by a woman. and that a woman had gone on this or had participated in this sort of these missions, these sort of colonial missions or these expeditions. And so encountering the drawings, that was like the first thing, and I immediately knew that I wanted to, that I saw the work, the sort of final work as a film. So immediately, I think with this encounter, with this sort of encounter with these long strips of like these landscapes that were made on pen, and what you see in the film is the same sort of visual language that's used in the film. So, it's sort of this yellowed out paper and the sort of pen drawing. So when you encounter the film, that's what you see initially. So, and then later, encountering her book. So she had been sending, over the 3 years, she had been sending letters to her family and friends in Germany. And so these letters were detailing the different sites that they'd gone to or walked through, because it was obviously a track, there weren't cars at that time.
Yeah.
All the different sites and the different villages that they'd sort of moved between over the 3 years, the food, the landscape, the weather. What was also quite evident was their thinking about Black people. So there's a lot of that in the sort of book or these letters. But the part that struck me the most was the part where she speaks about them having, this number, I always get it wrong, so I won't get it right today. Them having, I think, over 700 people carrying these objects that that they took out of Cameroon.
Sure.
So these are big objects through the different sort of villages, and so thinking about this idea of like the carriers, because actually that's not what we think about when we think about all of these objects that are now in these sort of Western museums. So that's why that was a huge part of the film. So so what you see in the film is me carrying these objects. I'll go into the film slightly later. So thinking about this idea of like this burden, so this sort of, just this labor. So thinking about the carriers also as having found work because they were being paid. I mean, let's say they were being paid for this job of assisting in this job of carrying these things, which are now in multiple museums in Germany.
Yeah, I think it's interesting the angle that you're looking at it from, especially the fact that she said it was a woman who basically wrote all of these things and then also initiated the carrying of these objects.
I mean, let me I'm not putting it like that. Because the reality is it was her husband that was commissioned. So
okay.
As I said, he was a professor, he was a geographer, and he was the one that was initially commissioned. I think for me it was to think about the female gaze within that context.
Yeah.
So it wasn't that she was the main person. I mean, they both were, because I mean, I think even the articles that they published, they were co-published and all of those things. But it was also thinking about. So it's got many. I mean, also I think the experience of the film is that it's about this implication, I think, of many people, I think, on this journey.
Yeah.
So that's why, the experience of it is that you're almost supposed to walk with her and take this journey with her.
But I guess I'm interested in the fact that it was a woman, because you hardly ever hear of women's role during this period in time in history. So it's an interesting kind of like another kind of juxtaposition or contradiction in that you have this woman who was doing these things but was also enacting a type of violence on the people of Cameroon as well.
Yes, and I mean, I think that also becomes quite evident in the language that's also used. I mean, it wasn't German, it had to be translated, the book had to be translated for me. But there's an obvious violence also in the language, and just like, because it indicates quite strongly the perception of their perception of Black people.
Yeah, so the gaze is quite prominent in their descriptions.
Exactly. So the journey obviously started with the encounter of the drawings, to then the book or the letters. There were many photographs as well, as I'd mentioned, but which I don't use for the purpose of the film. And then the book itself, or the book and what was written in the book became quite crucial in how I then sort of wrote the script for the film. And then later then deciding to then go to Cameroon and go to some of these sites that she then mentions in the diary, the sites where they took the different objects, and working with people on site to find almost identical objects, which the film is basically about this journey of me returning the objects. So that's why you see me so it's 22 panels, and I've gone to quite a few sites. Now I can't recall because it's been chopped up quite a bit. So going to these different sites that she mentions, the different villages and cities that she mentions, and returning the objects. So how the film started is basically I'm carrying this large sack that is also from one of their fabrics or their materials. And then I'm going to all of the different sites and dropping off an object. I mean, so you first see me enter on a boat, which is also about how they arrived on a boat. And at the end of the film, I'm basically leaving on a train, and I don't have any, the sack is empty. And I'm leaving on a train, which then also speaks to industrialization and the first train that was introduced in Cameroon, that she speaks about also in the book.
So there's a kind of like retrieval of the work, retrieving the artworks that were taken or the works that were taken, and you putting them back into their rightful places. So it's almost like a healing type of thing that you're engaging with. And did you find that the people that you engaged with in Cameroon were very receptive to your performance or to your intervention?
Okay, so I'll start with the idea of the objects. So it's obviously a symbolic restitution of the objects, because these are in the different museums in Germany. We just got an inventory of the objects, and then worked with people on site who then helped us source similar objects to those. So it isn't the actual objects, but it is very much speaking to also restitution, but also to land. So the first frame after coming off the boat is about this, speaks to one of the parts in the book where she speaks about one of the sites having such red soil. And so I'm pouring this soil back into the land. So it is about, thinking also about land, and how, at the end of the day, a large part of this is actually about what has been extracted from the land, and how the land is then left having all of these traces of colonization, basically. So returning the sand to the land is, for me, it's actually one of the main part of the film. And I can't recall now what your second question was about.
It's okay, I was just asking what the healing process is like, and if the people in Cameroon were receptive. Yeah.
Geez, I mean, the encounter was a difficult one. I think not because they weren't receptive. It was just a really tough film to make. For many different reasons.
Okay.
Language barrier. The part that we were in was French speaking, because there's the French speaking and the German side, because they were colonized actually by the Germans at some point, then the French at some point, then the British at some point. So it's also a really difficult place, I think, for different reasons. But the different encounters were interesting. Let me leave it at that. It was just really difficult to produce and to be traveling at that rate, because we're there for about 2 weeks, just under 2 weeks. And to go to the different sites, I mean, some are like deep rural, some it's like you were told the hike was going to be 3 hours, and the hike was 7 hours.
Wow.
And you've got equipment, and I mean, it was just too many things to really go into. But but the film happened. That's it.
Yeah. So I'm also wanted to know, in terms of the film and how we would like us to see it as the viewers, what do you want us to take away from the film?
I mean, it's always, those questions are always very difficult to answer. You know, I think it's, the production on site here has also not been, you know, has been also its own interesting part. So again, it again speaks to the sort of torture of making the film itself. So, and I mean, it is, you know, it's also dealing with too many different realities of, I mean, one is that the film was obviously a commission by this museum in Cologne in Germany. And honestly, it was, I say it was one of the best experiences, I think, in terms of just like a proper collaboration and being open to what that means, and the sort of many difficult conversations that that inviting an artist that has to actually respond to what you have, that you know already know is problematic, what that means, and the sort of 2-year journey of research, first year research, second year production. So it was many different things, but it was a really rich experience. I think I'm eternally grateful that we agreed to, you know, to do this in the end. Also because it was also facing many realities of also what it looks like making a work outside of South Africa and outside of Southern Africa. And then bringing the work home for the first time to already a very difficult city that also has its own histories and difficulties. That's also been interesting, I think, for me to sort of bring the work into the space, to think about also, because the work is speaking to labor, it's speaking to it's speaking to all of these issues and the Black body in this conversation. And so to bring it into a site that, you know, where there's also like a vineyard, you know, and labor in relation to that, Black labor in relation to that. So I think there's all of these things that are really sort of coming up in relation to what that means to, because there are many questions, I think, for me also about having the work within the German context, and, you know, what that, the sort of looking to self that the work was sort of calling to for the people there, and then taking the work, bringing the work here to South Africa and what that means and what that looks like. So it's been many things, I think, for me that I still need to reflect on.
Okay. Yeah, and I think it's such pertinent work because I think the issue of restitution, the issue of colonization, the issue of labor, land, everything you mentioned is still very much part of our contemporary understanding of South Africa and of Africa as a whole. Yeah, so thank you very much for answering my questions and being part of this podcast interview. And that is it for me.
Thank you.
Thank you.